I imagine Lisa has in mind
Uh-huh.
that there may not be enough chairs. She probably has.
She's got a handle on it, she's in the back.
Okay.
So I'm gonna give you the mic, and then you guys can pass it back and forth. You don't have to lean into this unless you
That's a
want to.
good idea.
Yeah. Well, welcome, everybody. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. This is one in a series. Oh, we have more people coming in. This is great. There's an empty seat up front.
That seems contrary.
The red is, yeah, it's flashing. You can see the red light flashing. Okay, as the last few are coming in, we are really glad to have a full house here for this part of the series. You know, when we started this last fall, we were sitting in the office, Lisa and I and Terry Tigan, and we thought, well, maybe this should be called Conversations with Clay. And I guess that's okay with me, but the real stars of the show are the people who we bring to have these conversations. My name is Clay Eels. I'm the Executive Director of the Southwest Seattle Historical Society. Does anybody know where Southwest Seattle is? You know, if you asked anybody who lives in West Seattle or White Center, do you live in Southwest Seattle? They would start scratching their head. But we call it that because all of the addresses are Southwest. And this was how the organization was named by our founder, Elliot Cowden. Irma Cowden, his widow, is right here in the front row. I'm so glad you're here today, Irma. And I'm really privileged to conduct this series here at Horizon House because there are so many people connected to West Seattle in the area that we serve, and yet you don't have to be connected to West Seattle to be interested in people. People are people, and they've got stories that are universal. In fact, the irony is that the more specific you get, the more universal you get, because then you can identify. And our guests today are Paul and Mary Margaret Pruitt, who live here at Horizon House, and I would say they are West Seattle through and through. They, I'm reminded by a friend of ours at our gala last November, who said, "I wasn't born in West Seattle, but I got here as soon as I could." And I think that's the case here with the Pruitts. They've got a long history before they came to West Seattle individually, but I want you to know we're going to focus on what their lives have been in the Seattle area and specifically in West Seattle. And it's a treat to have two people at once, because we have people who devoted their lives to public service in very different ways, but at the end of this we're going to talk a little about how they really weren't so different after all. And I've been privileged to know both Paul and Mary Margaret over the last few decades. When I was editor of the West Seattle Herald in the 1980s, I came into contact with both of them frequently, and it truly is an honor to have you here. Thank you very much. I'm going to start you off with an easy question, and that relates to you getting together. You two both met at Yale, and I would like each of you to take a chance at describing how the two of you met and what brought you together. What drew you to each other?
Well, we had a friend at Divinity School, actually. I was at Yale Divinity, and Mary Margaret was at the School of Nursing in New Haven. And this friend...
Paul, can you speak up a little louder?
Yeah, I guess I could, yeah. Thank you. Thank you for pointing that up. So she introduced, she was a classmate of Mary Margaret's at Penn State, and was she was studying in the Divinity School, as was I, and Mary Margaret was at the School of Nursing in New Haven. And so she introduced Mary Margaret to me, And so, as I say, the rest is history. And it's nice to get that together. That's where we started.
So Mary Margaret, could you elaborate a little bit on why the two of you were drawn to each other?
Well, as you know, the ratio at Yale, New Haven was really good for women, because at that time, the undergraduate school was all men, and it was only in the graduate schools of drama and history and medicine and law that they would let us women in. But out of all those Yale men, I was attracted to Paul Pruitt, not only by the recommendation of our dear friend Claire, but also because one day when I was out on a date with somebody else and happened to go by the movie theater where the Disney movie Songs of the South was playing. Do you remember that Disney movie? I always liked Disney movies, but this one was particularly interesting to me because there was Paul Pruitt out front ticketing this very popular movie. I'd never known anybody to picket before. I always thought they were radical, red-eyed, scoundrels. But I had already met him, and the reason he was ticketing was because he and some of his friends felt that the portrayal of African personalities in the movie was stereotyped and demeaning. They were all people who were in a category that the divinity school students said should not be. So that caught my attention, and he's gotten it ever since.
Would you mind telling us the year?
Yes, what year are we talking about?
Well, Paul started in 1945, so he finished in 48, and Peggy Klein and I started in 46. So our class, the span would have been 46 to 48 when we were together.
Paul, can you give us a little more context about this picket outside the movie theater? I want to know what drove you to participate in that and what became of it afterward.
Well, we were always thinking that all of us should be treated with respect, and we felt the movie was very stereotypical of Afro-Americans, and so we were protesting the way that they were. It was not accepting them in respect, that we expect people to be respect with, and that was the reason that we were picking for that they were not portrayed in the movie with respect at all.
Well, can you tell us what happened as the result of your picket? And maybe what was on the picket signs themselves?
Well, from that day forward, all Afro-Americans were treated with respect. We won that one. No, I don't remember what exactly were on the signs. I think just the picketing, just walking around and having the divinity school students there.
Would that have been your first step at social activism?
No, it may have been, yeah. Except in the context of that, my father was a minister, and he was, and also with his sermons were certainly with connections with the importance of being socially active. And I don't remember my father walking a picket line, but you don't have to do that to be concerned about people being treated respectfully and working for the equality of all people of whatever color, including white people.
Okay, before we get you out to the West Coast, I want this audience to know a little bit about why each of you went into the fields you were, as reflected in the schooling you were getting. Mary Margaret, why the medical profession? And then Paul, why the ministry?
When I was an elementary school teacher, our church had invited a missionary to come and speak, and I was so moved by this person and the kind of work that they were doing. And I also read a lot of books about missionaries that my parents intentionally placed easily at hand. And so I had decided by the time that I was very young that I would like to work someplace around the world in helping people who had less opportunities than we had in South Central Pennsylvania, where I was growing up. And when I was 11, I came down with appendicitis and landed in the hospital on a Sunday afternoon having an emergency appendectomy. And this was a long time ago, dearies. No penicillin and a lot of other advantages that we have now. And so for a simple appendectomy, I ended up staying in the hospital 11 days. I mean, people have brain surgery now and they're out in 2 or 3. But that was then, and I loved it. And I decided I never wanted to go home. I just wanted to live at the hospital forever. So with that in mind, I took a lot of biology, chemistry, and physics in high school and went off to college with the intent of being a medical missionary. And when I met Paul, I realized that this was not his dream. He dreamed of being a pastor, a leader in a community in church. And so this was a real life crisis for me. Was I failing to hear the voice of God? Had I been wrong all those years when I thought I was headed into the medical missionary work? But I decided if I was wrong, God would love me anyway, and so I married Paul.
I want to tell you about my operation. As a child, of course, before in West Seattle, I had, at a time when you had a side ache, they took out your appendix just in case they were the problem. So I had mine taken out, and I'm without appendix, but I think probably it was unnecessary, but it was just something was done at that time.
So Paul, tell us why you had the fire in the belly to become a minister.
It was, I guess you'd say, with my background and and our family, which is a church family. My father was the pastor, and I admired him very much. And I did consider another possible occupation, and that was in music, because we're very, very musical in the church, of course, and I loved music, and I thought in terms of then going into school music, but the admiring my father so much and seeing how much could be accomplished working with people and how many of the needs of people were taken care of, that I was concerned about. That was the ministry was the best place to be. I'm sure there were other influences other than that, but that was a major one.
Paul, what was your musical particular interest in? Do you have an instrument?
Catherine's asking what Paul's musical interest was specifically.
At different times, you know, the church music, the hymns were always with all of the places we were in the church were stimulating to me, and I guess Mary Margaret used to say that I could sing about 20 or 30 of them all by heart and all the verses, and I think that may have been true, and so that was true. I developed, as the years went on, a lot of interest in all classical music. Later, well, I suppose it started in West Seattle at that time. Then I expanded my interest and even liked kind of mild jazz.
I think what Catherine is getting at is that when you were considering a musical career, what kind of a career? Vocal, instrumental, any specific ideas?
Well, in the schools that I knew, the musical, the director, you know, that I knew and admired very much, and I think is true of the others, would deal with instrumental, and I did at that time, was at that particular time had the cornet that I did later in life, and that would be prior to West Seattle, was the French horn, so instrument was
what I wanted to
very
know,
interested, but always vocal, mainly vocal.
Okay, it was not long after the two of you met and married that the West Coast came calling. And we're not talking West Seattle, we're talking one of my favorite small towns, and that's Anacortes. Tell us how you got out to Anacortes and what roles each of you played there. I don't care who goes first. It'll get back to Paul with his ministry, but you had some
I
roles
was
there too.
second, so why don't you?
Okay, Paul, Anacortes, you were actually dancing in 3 different roles there, correct?
Well, after graduation from Yale Divinity School in 1948, this was the first parish. I was a year ahead of Mary Margaret, and there was no question, but she should finish out the School of Nursing. That was not, that was supportive of that. We didn't have to be married right away to keep our interest with each other, of course. And what was your question?
You got to Anacortes. Tell us the 3 different roles you had in Anacortes.
It was a combined parish of 3 churches. So that we had the roles in 3 different ones. So it's Summit Park, maybe some of you know Summit Park. It was a church, and then Anacortes was the big one, almost 100 members, maybe not quite that big church. And then Guimas Island, and so I served them, we served them. I took the major role, of course, with the preaching, and began in Summit Park with the service, conducting the service and preaching at 9 a.m., and then went to the Anacortes Church and taught a Sunday school class at 10 or 10:30, and then had the service preached at 11 o'clock. Went home to have to eat, and then went to Guimas Island to catch a ferry across across the channel at 2:30, and held the service there, and then came back to Anacortes with a room full of young people. They met in our house, many from Summit Park, and so we had that very active, wonderful active group, and a wonderful leader that took charge of those kids, as long as you can take charge of those kids. And then I was part of getting them back home. Their parents had dropped them off, or someone else had brought them, but they didn't come after them. So then I was out taking them back to their homes at night, and that was I think pretty much the end of that day, which was a
You
very
had-
long day.
You had 5 different jobs that day.
Yeah.
I counted them.
That's, okay, well.
That's a busy Sunday, and
That was a
meanwhile,
busy Sunday, and Mary Margaret, so I said, please, let's not plan anything for me on Monday.
meanwhile, the hospital came calling for you, and beyond describing what you did, talk a little about your thoughts between being a doctor and being a nurse. Why the nursing really attracted you? Why that role was more compelling than knowing all of the details that a doctor would need?
Well, I'm not sure enough that I'm smart enough to pass medical school anyway, but about the time that I hit college chemistry, I thought, 7 years of this? I don't think so. And I also thought very realistically, I don't think I'll ever get married. I don't think, 1, that anybody would have me, and 2, I don't think there's anybody that I would have, so the chances of my getting married are very slim. But in case I did, I would hate to have gone through 7 years of college and all of my parents' resources and then get married and have children, because I would want to be the one nurturing them. And so I thought, you know what? The other thing is, doctors have a tremendous amount of responsibility. They're the ones who are making life and death decisions, and I just thought that isn't really the role that I want. So I was led to go into nursing by my own sense of what my wishes and talents and abilities were, and I loved it. I can't believe I would have been any happier as a doctor. And I've already told Clay this, so that's why he was prompting me. Anacortes was the only place I've ever lived where they called me and said, please come to work for us, because it was a small community of about, I think, 8,000 at that time. And there was a community hospital that had about 27 beds in it. And with that population, it was hard to find enough registered nurses to do the staffing. So I was barely there a week or 2, and of course there had already been an article in the paper, local pastor marries RN, and they were willing. It turned out that I didn't want to miss a single meeting at any of these 3 churches, and they needed night nurses, so it was a perfect job, because in those days I thought there was no problem to work all night and then go to church meetings all day. I couldn't do it now.
Some correction there, friends who know Mary Margaret so well. Can you believe that she was so desperate for someone being interested in her? Can you believe that she had plenty of suitors? and I had to compete with a lot of them, and I don't know really, knowing some of them, how I won out.
I think some of us can identify with that sentiment in our own lives. I'm going to jump forward a little bit. And again, before we get to West Seattle, we can't proceed without you talking a little bit about the Philippines. How did you end up there? And how did you both end up there? And what were your roles there?
Well, I told you that when Paul was courting me, and I was courting him, I discovered that my dream, what I felt was what I wanted to do more than anything else in the world, and what he wanted to do were not together. And I realized that the world is God's, and whether you're in ministry in this place or this place, maybe isn't as important as that you are doing what you think you ought to do wherever you are. And so I did not ever say to Paul, I won't marry you unless you are willing to work in some place outside the United States. And he never, ever said to me, if you will marry me, I will work in other places for at least part of the time. And so it was absolutely amazing to me after we had been together in Anacortes for 2 or 3 years that we invited a missionary speaker to come and talk in our 3 churches. And after that missionary, he happened to be somebody who was working in Micronesia. And I believe that we were aware, even at that time, of the terrible injustice that the United States had done in some of those Pacific islands. We were testing nuclear weapons, I think you're aware of that. And some of these native lands where people had, and their ancestors had lived for centuries, have been virtually destroyed as far as being habitable. I can't remember all the message of this missionary, but anyway, Paul was deeply impressed, as was I, by this man's life and work and what he was doing. And after he left, Paul said, you know, I really would like to work in some other part of the world too. And so that's how it came about that we did go to the Philippines, and were there for 3.5 very, very wonderful, privileged years. My role, and this was amazing, this was back in 1952 to 56, and even way back then, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, which was our congregational overseas organization, had a policy that the husband got a check and the wife got a check in the same amount. Isn't that amazing? And they also had the policy that somebody who was a doctor in a Manila hospital got the same basic wage as the 2 of us kids who were still in our 20s got, working way down in the island of Mindanao in the city of Davao. It was pure socialism, folks, but we loved it. And so most of the time my role was to be a part of the community with our daughter Janice and the daughter who was born there, Cynthia. But I also did get to help in founding a school for nurses and had a great semester teaching nutrition and diet therapy and learning all of the nutrients in pinakbit and lumpia and all those wonderful Philippine dishes. I tell you, there's what they call a horseradish tree in the Philippines that has little leaves kind of like a locust, you know, a little branch and then lots of tiny little leaves. The calamungay leaves make spinach look anemic. Some of those tropical vegetables and fruits are just amazingly loaded with good stuff. So that was a happy role for me.
Out of my religious faith, I was looking forward to where we could serve, and I would serve with people who were in real need. And certainly a lot of them in the Philippines, these people that we served in our churches there, and they were prominent in other ways too. I mean, they were in need. And to do what I could with working with them in religious services and also in training, which I did for not having great background in agriculture, but was able to help them to get the resources to work in their fields and so forth. So there was that contribution, but the looking out for a life work, wherever I worked, it was important for me, certainly to take care of myself. Important. If you don't take care of yourself, how are you going to take care of others? So that was part of it. But never be in in a situation where I would entirely concentrate on myself and being served. And of course, I was never was going to be apart from my family, my wife, and our 4 children. But to be in a situation where I feel I could contribute something to their lives to help meet some of their needs. This was not a dramatic bullet to take care of all their needs, but I think I contributed, we contributed some there. Mary Margaret, some of her nursing is important to take care of some of those needs, and that was important for me.
Can one of you or both of you paint a picture of an example of what you did in the Philippines that illustrated the work that you were doing? What would be a program or an incident or something that comes to mind that people could be able to picture you working there doing?
Well, in their agricultural economy, and I was able, even though I was not an agriculturalist, and I was only brought up in actually in West Seattle in a little garden that I had. That was my knowledge of agriculture. And, but was able to help in training stations for them. I could find some resources that they were not aware of. And so it was helpful to them to meet some of their needs and meet in the best ways. I think we also recognize not just by contributing some money to them. It wouldn't have gone around very far anyway to the money we had available in the mission. But to help them to tap on to some agriculture ways that the government supplied, and we could get the resources from them. And I think we all agree that's the best way that they help themselves, and many of them did. And I had something to do with their getting those resources and becoming better farmers and so forth.
Go ahead, Mary Margaret.
I think maybe one of the most things that we did that had a lasting effect was to welcome young adolescents into our home. Any of you who have traveled abroad are probably aware that in places like the Philippines, the work that we women do is very labor intensive. In most of the places that we lived, we were there about 3.5 years, as I said, and until the last year or so, we did not have refrigeration, and some of the places we did not have electricity. And so this meant, in order to wash the baby's diapers, somebody had to be squatting down at a low pan about maybe 8 inches from the floor, scrubbing those diapers with bar soap in cold water, which you had drawn from the well. And it wasn't possible for most young couples, and then in order to get food, you needed to walk to the market, or maybe you could get a jeepney to go to the market every day to get the market. And in order to cook the food, you had to build a little charcoal fire over with a tripod on it, unless you had, one place we had a kerosene stove, a couple places. So very quickly, I mean like that, we realized that we were going to have to fit into the pattern that most, 99% of Filipino families have. This, we're talking, about 60 years ago. It may be different now. But almost every family had dear Aunt Melinda, who never married or who was widowed, who lived with the family, and she would help with the laundry and the marketing. Or cousin Carmen, who was out of school, couldn't go to high school, didn't have money to go to high school, and she needed a place to stay, so she would come and help. In other words, almost every family, Filipino family we knew, had an extra person or two, which was true in our grandparents' homes. There was almost always somebody widowed or unmarried or an adolescent without a job. So that meant that immediately we began to look for people to live with us and to help me with the diapers and the cooking and the marketing and so forth. At one point, we had 6 young people living with us, and we all ate together and had our morning devotions together and so forth. At that time, when we had the most, 4 of them were in high school, because even with the public high schools, there were fees involved, which their parents weren't able to pay. And so they were eager. We always had many young people coming and saying, couldn't I live with you and work with you and you pay my school fees? So we would get recommendations from the pastors, and we had these 4 young women who were just such a delight. And then, even though Paul and I did study the dialect, we weren't, shall we say, fluent. We could get by. But when he wanted to say something theological, he really appreciated having somebody that could translate his sermons into Cebuano, which was the dialect that we learned. And so he had a young man who turned out to be psychopathic, but he had been in the war and had been tortured, so I think we'd say he had PTSD, poor guy. Anyway, he lived with us, and then he found a young 16-year-old boy who was from one of the very remote areas who had never been to school, and would you believe, he was so eager that he was even willing to sit with these little first graders, or whatever they put him in class, so that he could learn to read and write. So we had 4 young women and 2 young men. We're still in touch 50 years later with 2 of these dear friends who, one became a teacher, had a wonderful career teaching, and her children are educated. I think she put all of them through college. The other became a council member, a community leader in her community. Those were rich friends that we have cherished all these years, and that was a part of my job too.
That's an experience that many of us will not have. I need to move us forward pretty quickly. Something quick?
That's great. One of the what they face, like in the church, we also face with them collecting our water from the rain. And they didn't have a water system, and not everyone had wells, and we collected that. And the dilemma was when we collected the water, and a neighbor and neighbors didn't collect any, and they were without water. What can you do? You're not going to give up your water to someone else, but how do you work it out to share some and work it out? And churches had that dilemma and tried to do some sharing of that water. This is one of the many problems that they had in the Philippines.
Well, I'm going to skip over a few other times. I mean, it seems like when you came back to the Philippines, you were ever determined to get closer into Seattle. There was Lowell, there was Everett. You started a church in University Place and then Clover Park. But I want to move you a little further beyond that to your taking the pastorship at High Point in West Seattle. A huge turning point in your life, both of your lives. I dare say that was a quite different circumstance than you had ever faced before. And could you talk a little bit about why you took that on and how that came about?
I was looking for a pretty non-traditional type of parish, and that would be a parish where you would spend a lot of time in the community, helping people in the community. And High Point was where there were a lot of needs. And so I had a design in mind what that ministry would be like. And I was there with the help of particularly, I might say, one of our residents here, who promoted that. And this was the type of parish that, as it went out to, which was wise, over the nation actually, for a different kind of a church setup, a lot less given to the organization and committees and boards, and not giving that time, but looking out to the community and the ministry being in the community.
And could you describe for this group what the High Point neighborhood was at that time? It's vastly different now. What was it then in the 1970s?
Well, it was, of course, there's better housing there, but it was good enough housing, really, for people, and low income, eligible to come in at low income, and a lot of very, very good people. It was, I think that we treated it, and there were not only the Pruitts, but as a part of the community. By and large, it was thought of being segregated from, there's High Point, and they do their thing, and here's West Seattle, and they're not really a part of it. And I think maybe that over the years, I'm pretty sure that some of that has been ameliorated, and it is thought of at West Seattle also.
In the 40s, when World War II was escalating, there was a huge need for shipbuilders. And Seattle, as we all know, was a place where there were a lot of ships being made. So this housing project was built and populated by people who migrated to Seattle to build all the ships that were needed. And it was a very proud community. They would have community dinners and dances and games. And at the end of the war, it was then made into low-income housing, and at the time, I believe, had 4,000 people living there. That was as big as the town I came from in Pennsylvania. And you had to have a low income, as Paul said, in order to live there. And the fact that the churches in the West Seattle community felt that there should be a ministry for people who didn't often have cars and who had special needs, made it possible for Jim Reynolds and some of the other pastors in that community to get together and say, let's have one pastorate that is interdenominational, will serve Catholics, Protestants, Jews, whatever. We didn't have Muslims, I don't think, in those days. And see if we can get a medical clinic, a dental clinic, a food bank, a clothing bank. The community center, the neighborhood house, was very, very instrumental in being a partner in all of this. And by that time we had 4 children, and so it was very exciting for us to move in. Paul wanted to be within walking distance, so Elliot Cowden sold us a wonderful house that was just a few blocks away from the housing project. It was exciting, even though it was 1968, to feel that we were really on the growing edge of West Seattle. We had wonderful neighbors named Bread no, butter bread. Their name really was Butterbrot, but they told me it meant butter bread. And they told us that 25 years earlier, the street we lived on was unpaved. It was still such a new part of Seattle. The house was built, I think, in about 1924 by a prize fighter. I think he was a lightweight fighter. But the people from whom we bought it had 4 or 5 children. One of the nice things that the neighbor told us was, "Oh, we're so glad that you have a house full of children again," because Mr. Sanford, from whom we bought the house, had been living there alone for a while. So that part, oh, we had the most wonderful places to pick blackberries. You think they're still there? No, the developers have ruined it.
I failed to say with Reynolds that had a lot to do with Jim. He didn't just pick me out for this job, but we came to West Seattle because his help in that different type of church and serving that different type of church. And his wife was right there, Adele was right here. They're here in our house.
Mindful of the time, I'm going to move us a little more quickly now because we're rounding third and heading home. And it seemed like it's only taken 5 minutes. We could go for another couple of hours. But I want to cover a couple of areas. First with you, Paul, talking about going from a pastor in in High Point and being such a part of the community to running for and serving in the state legislature for several terms. Talk to us about how that happened, that natural transition, and your concept of it being an extension of your ministry.
Well, as I've said to several others, that I learned about politics in the church. At home, and politics thinking is always bad. No, politics is a part of bringing things together and making decisions. And so a political career is not always accepted that way, and I think we shoot ourselves on the foot by categorizing all politicians as bad or politics as bad, and that's just not, it's a part of getting things done. And so I felt at home as we worked toward having improvements in High Point, and one of the improvements was helped by Phyllis Lamfair, who is here. You'll be talking with her also to get some money to start a medical clinic and a dental clinic in High Point, and I was part of getting that done and having those facilities which are helpful, and it just fits into what all of life I've felt, and it started in the church with my father and with our churches, that we take care of ourselves, of course, as I said before, we need to, but we should always, it's part of the faith that I believe in and practice in church and outside of churches, to concentrate giving our time, of course, also money too, to those who have spatial needs, and there are plenty of those people around the world, but also in our nation and in our city too.
And this was a hallmark of your legislative career, your 4 terms. You worked toward those goals as well.
I worked towards those goals, and my legislation that I sponsored and I signed on to and promoted, a lot of it was to take care of those in need, and I was also part of legislation such as getting the new Seattle Bridge, which came through, and I was able to promote. with more than just the poor, but there are a lot of the poor that have that need. And some of the legislation that I got, prime sponsored, did support and get help to them.
Meanwhile, your kids had been growing up, and the school district was calling, Mary Margaret. And this is the other topic I want to make sure we cover before we close. And I want to know why the schools for you. And then I'm going to ask you another question related to this.
Well, I always thought, as I told you, that I would work in a
Excuse me,
hospital.
let me make clear. She, after raising her kids, had a 20-year career as a school nurse in the Seattle Public Schools.
It was it was wonderful. It was just wonderful. I always wanted to work in a hospital, but when I was 40, I developed a disc problem in my back. We all know what backs are. Bipeds have back problems. And so I realized that lifting was not going to be something possible. And all of a sudden, I thought of school nursing when our eldest daughter was ready for college and we needed more income. So I went for an interview with real anxiety because I hadn't done much nursing for the previous 15 or 20 years while these 4 children were being born and nurtured. And would you believe the director of Seattle School Nurses was a Yale graduate? Oh my goodness. So I think I was in the minute I put in an application. And I did, as Clay said, I did love working for the next 22 years. One of the happiest assignments was in our neighborhood school where Irma Cowden was the librarian. And so that's where she and I got to be good buddies and friends and have been ever since. It was, to me, a wonderful experience to work with the administrators and teachers and staff, other staff at schools. I am a loyal supporter of public schools, and I think our Seattle school system is outstanding. Of course, I haven't been in it since 1991, but I think we have no idea, unless you've been a teacher yourself, the contribution that these folks give to our children. Anyone who thinks school teachers sit at a desk and give directions has never been in a classroom. So it was a great privilege, and I loved being a school nurse.
Now, Mary Margaret, I'm going to keep on you here. People don't really realize, in the same way that you talk about teachers, they don't realize what a school nurse does. Can you give us a little snapshot of what that is?
Oh,
it's not just
goodness, yes.
putting bandages on arms.
No, you know, for many youngsters, the school nurse is the primary care health person. When you realize that there are many schools, especially in our Seattle public school system, where the proportion of youngsters who are eligible for free lunch and hence are living in homes with very modest incomes is even more than 50%. And unless they are so poor that they qualify for Medicaid, or so wealthy that their parents know the doctors by their first names, the middle group of majority students often have a hard time getting the health care they need. So it's really important when youngsters come in as kindergartners or as new students from elsewhere to know whether they can see the blackboard and hear the teacher and whether they have mobility, dexterity, and that's what school nurses are supposed to do. So we spend an awful lot of time doing assessments, which are really important for learning. We spend an awful lot of time on paperwork because the state requires all children have immunizations for measles, mumps, rubella, pertussis, tetanus, diphtheria, and now they've added other things since I've been gone. Hepatitis, And what else? Can somebody else fill me in here? Oh, there's my doctor. What else is it that children are required to have? Anyway, it's the school nurse's responsibility to be sure that every child in the school has the immunization or has a valid reason that they can't have one. And of course, there are the bandages on the knees and the stomach aches and the headaches and the acute illnesses that we get called. The most angry phone call I ever had was with a mother whose child had head lice. And I think she felt I was responsible for that. How can you do this to me? I can't take off time. And
One more question, Mary Margaret. You also were responsible for some sexual education in the schools, and I'd like you to tell us the story that really was emblazoned on your brain that you were a part of.
There was a 6th grade. I love the Human Maturation series. I did classroom teaching at all levels, K through 12, and that was fun for me too. And so in the elementary schools where they had 5th and 6th graders, there was a unit on human maturation. And trust me, it was purely biological. We didn't have any how to have sex classes, but some parents were afraid we would. And so occasionally we would have parental nights when they could come and see the material that was going to be presented. And we did actually have to send notes home saying, is it all right if your child comes to this class taught by this harmless nurse? And 100% of the time, if they would actually look at the materials, they would say, oh, of course, I want them to know that. And so I had a favorite slide set. Do you remember slides? You're that old, aren't you? Now they're passé. But I had a favorite slide set. And in this favorite slide set, it started out like this. Your mother and father had many friends. Your mother had boyfriends, your father had girlfriends. And out of all these friends, they chose each other. They decided they loved each other the most. And they married. And then your mother's egg cell combined with your father's sperm cell, and you were conceived. And first you were a tiny set of cells, and of course there are all these slides with microscopic stuff. And then you became a very tiny baby, and for 9 months you grew in your mother's uterus, and then you were born, and the cycle of life began again. Well, I thought this was wonderful, and I showed it at every school, and I usually have 4 or 5 elementary schools a year. So I was showing this to one 6th grade class in one of my schools where there were practically 100% children of poverty. And there was an African American teacher, young man, probably in his 20s, who was the teacher of that school. And as I finished the slide set, beaming on these dear children, he said, now before you ask Mrs. Pruitt any questions, I want to ask you a question. How many of you children in this room are living with the mother whose egg cell and the father whose sperm cell united to help you begin growth? And not a single child raised her hand or his hand. And with real shame, I realized what I had done. And this wise teacher then said, I just want you to know that this is not your fault. You have nothing to do with the fact that you're not living with your birth father and mother. That's just your life. But you're a good person too. Well, I don't think I ever showed that slide set again, because I realized that my world was so different. And now it would be even more different for those children. But I learned so much from teachers about living in the world where the children are. And I hope I didn't do them immortal damage.
Well, thank you both for this. Before we go, we're about a couple minutes over time, but I've got to ask one last question, and you can answer it fairly quickly, I would imagine. We've had two wonderful people here before us today. They are a married couple for many, many decades. I want to know how your two separate pursuits have helped support each other. You've talked about how they've been different, but talk about some commonality, about how that's helped you over the years.
Well, I think the commonality is very definitely that we both wanted to serve where there were needs, where the people have need, and I think that comes out in what both of us said. And we were very much together on that. Never any time that either she said to me, well, you're spending too much time with other people, or never that I said, you're spending too much time with other people. And she still spends a lot of time with other people.
The night that we were engaged, we walked until about 3 o'clock in the morning. And before we went for this long walk in the rain and plighted our troth with each other, we went to see a grade B movie because it was the least worst of the movies in New Haven. And the name of the movie was Body and Soul. It was about a prize fighter. It was a dumb movie, but we figured that's very prophetic. We're going to deal with body and soul because everybody has each.
Would you all please give a big round of applause to Paul and Mary Margaret? Thank you so much for being part of this program. And before we close this up, Phyllis Lamphere, could you please stand in the back? I want you to be recognized because she was my first victim last November. Could you give Phyllis a hand? And Phyllis, who needs no introduction, Phyllis got so revved up by this that she's heading up a committee here at Horizon House to start a series of tours of Seattle's neighborhoods. And guess which neighborhood she's going to start out with? It's West Seattle. And I want you all to put on your mental calendars that this tour is going to take place on May 1st, May Day. And if you want to know more about this, please see Phyllis in the back, and we certainly will get more information out to you. I'm going to be a part of this too, and we're going to cover a lot of ground in West Seattle in a whole morning. And the other thing is to let you know that Paul and Mary Margaret here will be followed next month by somebody who's in the back of the room. Sylvia Odom will be my next victim. And this is just a delight for me to be able to just converse with people and for you to learn some more about people. And I've got to put in a plug for the fact that our museum in West Seattle, which will be on the May 1st tour, has an exhibit now that has a theme of work. How many here in the room have done any kind of work in your lives? I think you will be able to find something in this exhibit that you can identify with, and if you join the tour, you'll be able to come over and see. But I want you to know that Paul and Mary Margaret will be a part of this dynamic exhibit. Sylvia already is. And I thank you all for staying and a little bit over time. This is just a wonderful thing to do, and it wouldn't happen without all of you. Thanks so much.